Good evening, Ma'am. Good evening, classmates. I am Jennifer N. Paralag. For tonight, I will be discussing two topics: the collecting and analyzing diagnostic information and feeding back diagnostic information. These two topics are still part of the processes of organization development. Let's go to collecting and analyzing diagnostic information. For this topic, I have here with me the outline of my discussion. First, the introduction. Then, the diagnostic relationship. Methods for collecting data, sampling, and techniques for analyzing data. Introduction. Organization development is very dependent on organization diagnosis, which is the process of collecting information that will be shared with the client in jointly assessing how the organization is functioning and determining the best change intervention. Data collection involves gathering information on specific organizational features. The process begins by establishing an effective relationship between the organization development practitioner and people from the organization. There are four methods that can be used: the questionnaires, interviews, observations, and unobtrusive measures. Data analysis organizes and examines the information gathered, and the next step in the cyclic organization development process is the feedback of data to the client system. The diagnostic relationship. Organizational development practitioners play an active role in gathering of data from organization members for diagnostic purposes. Before collecting information, practitioners need to establish a relationship with those who will provide and subsequently use this information. And these are the organization or the members of this organization, which are the employees. To establish a diagnostic relationship between a consultant and organizational members is similar with that of making a contract. We have to explain and include in that contract all the conditions that we expect and aim in that relationship with the consultant. The following questions provide the content of the diagnostic contract. So these are the questions which answers should be included in the contract. Number 1. Who am I? This is the consultant or practitioner that should be introduced in the contract. Then, why am I here? And what am I doing? This is the purpose or aim of the data gathering activities. Who do I work for? Who hired the consultant or the practitioner? What do I want from you and why? It should be stated in the contract how much time, effort, and valid data people from the organization need to provide. How will I protect your confidentiality? It should be clarified in the contract who will see the responses. It should also be stated if the consultant will ensure confidentiality or is it an open information sharing. Number 6. Who will have access to the data? Will the respondent have an access to the data? And who else who will have access to the data gathered? Number 7. What's in it for you? These are the benefits expected from the diagnostic. And number 8. Can I be trusted? Trust should be established between the consultant and organization. Now, we'll go to methods for collecting data. The four major techniques of gathering diagnostic data are questionnaires, interviews, observations, and unobtrusive measures. Let us remember that no single method can fully gather all the data that we need because each method has certain strengths and weaknesses or disadvantage. Number 1. Questionnaires. One of the most efficient ways to collect data because it contains fixed response queries about various features of the organization. It can be administered to large number of respondents. It can be analyzed quickly, especially with the use of computers. As a result, the data can easily be fed back to the organization or employees. Questionnaires can be vary in scope. Some are standardized or fit to the needs of a particular client. What are the disadvantages? The responses are limited to the question asked in the instrument, so there is a little opportunity to ask for some clarifications. Employees may not provide honest answers, and others might answer questions in a socially acceptable manner. The second methods for collecting data is interviews. It can be individual or group interview, and probably the most widely used technique in collecting data in organization development. It permits both the interviewer and respondent to ask questions, so further clarification is possible as the interview goes on. It is very flexible to get private views and feelings about the organization during the interview. The interviewer can change the questions and ask other issues during the interview process. The disadvantage of interviews, however, is the amount of time required to conduct and analyze them. Interviews can consume a great deal of time, especially if the interviewers take full advantage of the opportunity to hear respondents out and change their questions accordingly. Personal biases can also alter the data. In interview, the questions may discourage or encourage certain responses. Interviewing takes a considerable skill to gather valid data. The third method is the observation. It is one of the more direct ways to collect data. The organization development practitioner may walk normally inside the office or organization. Look around for some incidents in the work area. In observation, the practitioner can become a member of the group or he may not also participate. He can situation himself and may use film, videotape, and other methods to record behaviors. Observations are free of the biases because the practitioner is directly in touch with the behaviors in questions. Without relying on others' perception, it also involves real-time data, describing the present behavior, not the past. This avoids the distortion that arises when people are asked to recollect their behaviors. Finally, observations are flexible because the consultant can modify what he chooses to observe, depending on the circumstances. One of the disadvantages of observation is the difficulties in interpreting the meaning underlying the observation. Since the observer is the data collection instrument himself, personal bias and subjectivity can alter the data unless he is trained and skilled in knowing what to look for. Another problem is sampling, knowing which people to observe, the time periods, places, and events in which to make those observations. And the fourth method for collecting data is the unobtrusive measures. Unobtrusive data are not collected directly from respondents, but from secondary sources, such as company records and archives. Examples are records of absenteeism, tardiness, grievances, quantity and quality of production, financial performances, meeting minutes, and correspondence with clients, suppliers, or government agencies. Unobtrusive data are free from respondent and consultant biases, perceived as being real, and tend to be quantified or reported at periodic intervals. Hence, it permits statistical analysis of behavior occurring over time. The problem with this method occurs in collecting such information and drawing conclusions from it. Altered reports can affect the analysis of data gathered. Sampling. Sampling answers the questions: how many people should be interviewed and who should they be? What events should be observed and how many? How many records should be inspected and which ones? Sampling becomes an issue when data are collected from selected members, behaviors, or records. Limited resources can also constrain sampling. Techniques for analyzing data. Data analysis techniques has two broad classes: the qualitative and quantitative. Qualitative techniques generally are easier to use because they do not rely on numerical data. The fact also makes them more open to subjective biases, but also easier to understand and interpret, while quantitative techniques can provide more accurate readings of the organizational problem. Qualitative tools has two methods: the content analysis and the force field analysis. Content analysis is a popular technique for assessing qualitative data, especially interview data, which attempts to summarize comments into meaningful categories. The categories with the most responses represent those themes that are most mentioned. This process can be quite formal. The second method is the force field analysis. It is derived from Kurt Lewin's three-step model of change. This method aims to develop a list of all forces promoting change and all those resisting it, and determines which forces is more powerful. Then, rank the order or strength of the different forces. We have three quantitative tools. The first one is the means, standard deviations, and frequency distributions. These represent the respondents' average score and variability of the responses. The second is the scattergrams and correlation coefficients. They are measures of the strength of a relationship between two variables. The third is the difference test. Compares a sample group against a standard for norm to determine whether the group is above or below the standards. We have to take note that these measures are normally produced by most statistical computer software packages. Therefore, mathematical calculations are not discussed here. Now, let us move on to the second topic: feeding back diagnostic information. The outline of my presentation for this topic is as follows. First, we will have the introduction, then determining the content of the feedback, properties of effective feedback, characteristic of the feedback process, steps in survey feedback, and organizational dependencies. Introduction. Perhaps the most important step in the diagnostic process is feeding back diagnostic information to the client organization. Although the data might have been collected with the client's help, the OD practitioner often organizes and presents them to the client. Properly analyzed and meaningful data can have an impact on organizational change only if organization members can use the information to devise appropriate action plans. A key objective of the feedback process is to be sure that the client has ownership of the data. Determining the content of the feedback. During the course of diagnosing the organization, a large amount of data is collected, more than the client needs, more than he can interpret in a realistic period of time. If too many data are fed back, the client may decide that changing is impossible. Therefore, OD practitioners need to summarize the data in ways that enable clients to understand the information and draw action implications from it. Next, we have the properties of effective feedback. The first one is the relevant. Organization members are likely to use feedback data if they find the information meaningful and relevant. Number 2, understandable. Readily interpreted and comprehensible through the use of graphs and charts. 3, descriptive. Data need to be linked with reality and use detailed illustrations. 4, verifiable. Feedback data should be valid and accurate. And then, timely. Data should be fed back to members as quickly as possible after being collected and analyzed to ensure validity. Limited. Data should be limited to what the employees can realistically process at one time. 7, significant. Limited to those problems that organization can do something about it. 8, comparative. Data from comparative groups should be provided. And 9, unfinalized. Feedback is primarily a stimulus for action and spur further diagnosis. Members should be encouraged to use the data for comprehensive discussion in the organization. It is not yet final. The organization has to do something about it. Then we have the characteristic of feedback process. 1. Motivation to work with the data. People need to feel that working with the feedback data will benefit the organization and its members. Number 2, structure for meeting. Feedback meetings need some structure or they may experience chaos or aimless discussion. There should be an agenda for the meeting, and the leader should provide the direction of the meeting. The third one is the appropriate attendance. Proper representation of concerned members should be encouraged in the feedback meeting. 4. Appropriate power. Clarify the power possessed by the group. Members need to know on which they can make changes, which they can only recommend changes, and over which they have no control. Have a clear boundaries to avoid hesitation. 5. Process help. This is the assistance that should always be present in working together as a group, so that even negative feedback can bring positive motivation to members. Survey feedback. Survey feedback is a process of collecting and feeding back data from an organization through the use of questionnaire or survey. The data are analyzed, fed back to organization to develop interventions to improve it. We also have the steps in survey feedback. Number 1. Members of the organization, including those at the top, are involved in preliminary planning of the survey. Number 2. The survey instrument is administered to all members of the organization or department. Number 3. The OD consultant usually analyzes the survey data, tabulates the result, suggests approaches to diagnosis, and trains client member to lead the feedback process. Number 4. Data feedback usually begin at the top of the organization and cascade downward to groups, reporting to managers at successively lower levels. Number 5. Feedback meetings provide an opportunity to work with the data. Then we have the survey feedback and organizational dependencies. Traditionally, the steps of survey feedback have been applied to work groups and organization units with little attention to dependencies among them. Research suggests, however, that the design of survey feedback should vary depending on how closely the participating units are linked with one another. And lastly, we have the limitations of survey feedback. Number 1. Ambiguity of purpose. The managers and staff groups responsible for the survey may have difficulty reaching consensus about the purpose of the survey, its content, and how it will be fed back to the participants. Distrust. High level of distrust in the organization can render the survey feedback ineffective. Employees need to trust the confidentiality of their responses. Number 3. Unacceptable topics. Some organizations have topics that they do not want to be examined. This can limit the survey. And number 4. Organizational disturbance. The survey feedback process can unduly disturb the organization functioning. Data collection and feedback can invade employee work time. And that ends my report. Thank you very much.